When you think about the most transformative figures of the 20th century, Mao Zedong is a name you simply can't ignore. He took a fractured China and forged it into a powerful, unified nation. But the methods he used created a legacy of absolute power, ideological chaos, and immense human suffering that still defines the country today. This quote, it really gets to the very heart of his worldview. It's this core belief that the ultimate goal, a completely new Chinese state, justified any and all actions needed to get there. This conviction was basically the engine driving everything that came next.
So the big question is, how does one person rise to command the most populous nation on Earth? To get that, you have to rewind and look at the world he was born into, a China that was, frankly, falling apart.
Yeah, at the turn of the century, China wasn't a stable country. Far from it. It was a civilization in crisis. The old empire was gone, which created this massive power vacuum. Warlords carved up the country, foreign powers were exploiting the weakness, and for millions of ordinary people, life was just a constant struggle for survival. This kind of chaos was fertile ground for radical new ideas. His rise and rule are really marked by a series of massive, world-changing events. Think of this timeline as our roadmap. We're going to walk through each of these critical moments from the very beginning of the Communist Party all the way to his death.
Now, this is where we see Mao do something different. Traditional Marxism was all about the urban factory workers, the proletariat, right? They were supposed to be the heart of the revolution. Mao just flipped that script. He saw that in a huge agricultural country like China, the real revolutionary power was with the peasants. Building his base in the countryside was a total break from doctrine, and it ended up being his winning strategy.
Imagine this. You're facing complete annihilation by your rivals. What do? Well, the communist forces started a desperate, year-long retreat that covered thousands of miles of incredibly harsh terrain. 80,000 of them began this journey, facing starvation, disease, and constant attacks. And this is the great paradox of the Long March. On paper, it was a military disaster, but in reality, it became the foundational myth of the Communist Party. This brutal ordeal forged a hardened, loyal core of survivors, and from that crucible, Mao emerged as the movement's absolute, undisputed leader. So after surviving that march, then fighting a devastating war against Japan, and then winning a final brutal civil war, this is the moment, the culmination of it all. Mao stands up in Beijing and announces the birth of a new state. The revolution had succeeded. But now the challenge shifted from winning power to wielding it.
Right. So with the country finally under his command, Mao's first goal was to lock down his rule and completely remake the nation. And that meant getting rid of any and all obstacles to his vision.
And this process was incredibly fast and systematic. First, land was taken, often violently, from landlords and given to peasants. Next, anyone who was even perceived as an enemy was targeted in public campaigns of denunciation and execution. And then all the independent parts of society, the press, the courts, the whole economy, were brought under absolute state control. And at the center of it all, Mao himself. His picture was suddenly everywhere.
Okay, so with his power totally secure, Mao launched his first huge social experiment. He called it the Great Leap Forward. The goal was to basically rocket China's economy past the West's, to turn this agrarian nation into an industrial powerhouse, almost overnight.
The ambition here was just staggering. We're talking about herding the entire rural population into these huge communes, and at the same time ordering them to make steel in tiny homemade backyard furnaces. It was all driven by this pure belief that revolutionary energy could just defy the laws of economics.
Well, the experiment was a complete disaster. The steel from the backyard furnaces, it was totally worthless scrap iron, and pulling all those farmers away from the fields to make it, combined with some really bad new farming ideas, it led directly to a total collapse in the food supply. And this number, tens of millions, it represents one of the worst famines in all of human history. As food production crashed, local officials were too afraid to report the failure. In fact, They claimed record harvests. So the state, believing these lies, took even more grain from a countryside that was already starving. It was a man-made disaster on a scale that's hard to even comprehend.
You know, that devastating failure of the Great Leap Forward really weakened Mao's power inside the party. But his response wasn't to back down. Instead, he launched an even more radical campaign. This time, it wasn't about the economy. It was about purifying the revolution and making sure his power was once again absolute.
So the official goal was to wipe China clean of all old ideas, old customs, old culture, anything that smelled of capitalism or tradition. And his main weapon in this fight? The youth. Mao basically deputized millions of students as his Red Guards. They became this fanatical force, encouraged to attack anyone they thought was an enemy of the revolution. Their teachers, intellectuals, and even high-ranking party officials who dared to question Mao.
The consequence was 10 years of absolute chaos. I mean, society just broke down. Universities shut their doors, the economy ground to a halt, and the country spiraled into factional violence. A whole generation lost their education, priceless historical artifacts were destroyed forever, and millions of people had their lives completely ruined.
So while all this chaos is happening inside China, its place on the world stage was also shifting in a pretty dramatic way. Early on, Mao's China was allied with the Soviet Union, but they had a bitter falling out over ideology, and this led to one of the most shocking geopolitical moves of the entire Cold War. In 1972, Mao met with U.S. President Richard Nixon. He started a relationship with his biggest capitalist enemy, all to counter the threat from his old communist ally.
So after almost 30 years of nonstop revolution and this kind of iron-fisted rule, Mao's health started to decline, and the nation he had both built and, in many ways, battered, was bracing for a really uncertain future.
His death in 1976 really was the end of an era. The China he left behind was, no doubt about it, unified and a major power on the world stage. But it was also a nation that was deeply traumatized by decades of political terror, famine, and this ideological war that was waged against its own people. And this is where you get to the core conflict of his legacy. It's just full of these deep, irreconcilable contradictions. On one hand, he ended what's often called China's century of humiliation, and he built a strong, centralized state. But on the other hand, that relentless push for ideological purity and absolute power came at an absolutely catastrophic human cost.
And after he died, the shift was almost immediate. His most extreme followers, known as the Gang of Four, were arrested. The new leadership, led by Deng Xiaoping, started to slowly and carefully take apart the Maoist economic system and open China up to the world. They set the country on a path that would have been completely unthinkable just a few years before.
And that really brings us to the bottom line. You simply cannot understand modern China without understanding Mao. His influence is just baked into the DNA of its political system, its institutions, its whole national identity. His legacy isn't some dusty old thing in a history book. It's still a living, breathing, and very contested force today.
This leaves us with the central, very difficult question of his rule. How do you measure a legacy that contains both the unification of a nation and a human cost of that magnitude? There really are no easy answers, just the profound and often painful complexity of a history that continues to shape our world.